Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. We're from the news team here at hkcitizen.net.
And today, we're actually going to be digging into an article we recently wrote and published on the site.
That's right. It's titled China's WTO Promises, Unfulfilled Commitments, Mutual Accusations, and the Risk of Global Isolation. A bit of a mouthful, but it covers a lot.
It really does. And our mission today for this deep dive is basically to unpack the main arguments from our own article. We want to look at the evidence we presented.
And really try to understand the potential consequences of all this trade friction that's been going on between China and the U.S.
Exactly. And we're doing that through the lens of China's promises, the
Yeah.
ones it made way back in 2001 when it joined the World Trade Organization.
Yeah, so we'll revisit those original commitments like we did in the piece. We'll look at where progress has genuinely been made.
But also critically, where those promises seem unfulfilled, and look at the accusations flying back and forth between, well, Beijing and Washington.
It's quite the situation. Our article framed it around these mutual accusations, both sides saying the other is breaking WTO rules.
And it raises this really serious question, which we wanted to explore more today. Is China potentially facing sort of international isolation because of this escalating trade war?
We even mentioned in the article some pretty strong critiques comparing China's approach under Xi Jinping to, well, a mafia boss, strong language.
Very strong. And it leads to that fundamental question we posed. Are we actually watching the global trade order, the system we've known, start to fracture?
Okay, let's dive in. Starting at the beginning seems right. China joining the WTO in 2001, that was just huge, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. A watershed moment. We completely changed the global economic map. And China made some pretty big commitments to get in.
Right. The core ones were about opening up its markets, wasn't it? Lowering barriers, agreeing to play by the global trade rules.
Precisely. And those promises covered a lot of ground. Things like cutting tariffs, liberalizing services, protecting intellectual property.
And ensuring, fair competition within China itself, a level playing field.
So looking back, because it's been over 2 decades now,
Yeah.
where did China actually deliver? As we noted in our article, it's not like nothing happened.
No, definitely not. There
Yeah.
was progress. You pointed out the tariffs, for instance.
That's a big one. We highlighted that in the article.
Right.
China's average tariffs came down significantly. They were, what, over 40% before?
Something like that, yeah. Very high.
And they brought them down to around 10%. That was a major step, fulfilling a key part of the deal.
Okay, that's a substantial change. What else?
Well, there were legal reforms, too, aligning China's laws with WTO rules.
Yeah.
We mentioned TRIPS, the agreement on trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights.
Ah, yes. TRIPS. So setting up things like patent and trademark systems.
Exactly. They did establish those systems as part of joining. So the legal structures were put in place, at least on paper.
Right, on paper. What about market access?
Yeah.
Services like telecoms or retail. That always seems to come up.
Yeah, our article touched on that. There was some opening up. Foreign companies could come in, but often with strings attached.
Like the joint venture requirements.
That's the main one.
Yeah.
You often had to partner with a Chinese company. So yes, access was granted, but maybe not always on, let's say, fully equal terms.
Okay, so a bit of a mixed bag there. Progress, but qualified progress.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. Now, let's shift to the friction points. The unfulfilled commitments, according to the U.S. and its allies. Our article detailed several key areas. Let's start with tech. That feels like ground zero sometimes.
It really is a major flashpoint. Despite promises on services, big U.S. tech firms think Google, Facebook, they're still effectively blocked.
The Great Firewall being the main mechanism.
Largely, yes. That and the censorship requirements.
Yeah.
It makes it impossible for companies like that to operate freely.
And we argued in our piece this clashes with basic WTO principles.
Absolutely. Things like non-discrimination, market access. Google pulled out way back in 2010 because of this. Facebook never really got in. It looks like selective market access.
Okay, another big one, state subsidies. Our article really dug into this as an ongoing issue.
It is. China was supposed to reduce preferential treatment for its state-owned enterprises, its SOEs. But our research showed massive subsidies are still happening.
We cited the solar panel industry example, right? That was quite a figure.
Yeah, an estimated $15 billion in subsidies just in 2023. $15 billion. That gives those companies a huge advantage.
And the implication for global trade.
Well, it distorts markets. It makes it incredibly hard for companies elsewhere playing without that kind of government backing to compete fairly. It just undermines the idea of level playing field, which is core to the WTO.
Okay. Then there's the perennial issue of intellectual property. IP theft.
Still a massive problem, as we noted. Counterfeiting costs brands billions. We also touched on forced technology transfer.
Right, the idea that foreign companies sometimes feel pressure to hand over their tech secrets just to get market access. We mentioned Tesla in that context.
Yes, and that kind of pressure, well, it clearly goes against the spirit of fair trade principles.
And wasn't there a recent WTO ruling on China's IP enforcement?
There was. We pointed to a 2024 ruling that found China's enforcement wasn't adequate, directly conflicting with its TRIPS obligations.
Okay, moving to agriculture. Always a tricky area in trade. What are the ongoing issues there?
Our article described China using non-tariff barriers, things like really strict sanitary standards, import quotas, basically ways to restrict imports without using tariffs.
We had that specific example about U.S. soybeans, didn't we?
Yeah, from 2024. Facing arbitrary inspections, hurdles that seem designed to limit access. Again, it goes against the market access rules agreed under the WTO.
And then currency manipulation. The U.S. has accused China of this for years.
They have. The argument is China keeps the yuan artificially low to make its exports cheaper. Our article mentioned the offshore yuan hitting a record low in April 2025.
Which brought criticism from the U.S. Treasury again.
Exactly. They see it as distorting fair trade.
What about the digital space? Cloud computing.
Another friction point. China's 2017 cybersecurity law requires data localization data has to be stored in China.
Which impacts foreign cloud providers like Amazon Web Services.
Right. And many see that requirement as violating the WTO's national treatment principle, the idea you should treat foreign and domestic firms alike.
And finally, on this list of grievances, investment hurdles, even after that 2020 foreign investment law.
Yeah, the law aimed to improve things, but our article pointed out that opaque approval processes are still a problem. We use the example of U.S. healthcare firms facing regulatory roadblocks. Just doesn't quite square with the promises of liberalization.
Okay, so that's a pretty long list of complaints from the U.S. side. Now, our article also covered the U.S. response, mainly tariffs.
That's right. Faced with these perceived failures, the U.S., especially under Trump, but continuing, ramped up tariffs significantly. We noted they hit, 145% on some goods by 2025?
A huge number, a real escalation.
Definitely.
And China, of course, hit back.
Of course, retaliatory tariffs reportedly up to 84% on some U.S. goods. And crucially, they restricted exports of rare earths.
Which are vital for so much tech.
Absolutely critical.
Our article mentioned this causing a collapse in shipping, an empty vessel crisis. That sounds dramatic.
It paints a picture, doesn't it? Bilateral trade plummeted. Ships were going back empty from the U.S. to China. It shows the real-world disruption these tariffs cause. The U.S. view, though, is that this pressure is necessary.
Necessary to force China to comply.
That's the argument.
But as we also explored in our piece, China has its own narrative. They say the U.S. is the rule breaker here.
They do. Increasingly vocal about it. They argue U.S. tariffs, and especially the export controls on things like AI chips and semiconductors, are basically an illegal blockade under WTO rules.
We mentioned China's UN representative calling out restrictions on Huawei and TikTok.
Yeah, arguing those actions are discriminatory, violate free trade principles, and unfairly target Chinese companies without proper WTO justification.
And China's other main point is that the U.S. is just bypassing the WTO system altogether with these unilateral tariffs.
That's central to their argument. They say the U.S. should use the WTO's dispute settlement process, not just slap on tariffs. They point to specific gate articles, Article 1 on non-discrimination, Article 2 on tariff commitments, saying the U.S. is ignoring them.
So this brings us back to that critical question we raised in the article. And for you listeners, is it possible both sides are breaking the rules?
It seems increasingly likely that's the case, or at least that both are undermining the system. Trade law experts often suggest this.
Okay, let's quickly recap the case against China again.
Sure. The tech barriers, the massive state subsidies, the IP issues, the non-tariff barriers in agriculture, all seen as inconsistent with their original WTO promises. And we mentioned that 2023 WTO ruling on agricultural quotas, plus ongoing subsidy disputes.
And the case against the U.S.
Primarily, the unilateral tariffs imposed outside the WTO system, and the export controls on tech. Our article cited that 2022 WTO panel ruling against U.S. steel tariffs as relevant precedent, and the semiconductor controls might violate ATD Article Many Y on quantitative restrictions.
Our article used the phrase mutual hypocrisy. Does that feel right?
It kind of captures the dynamic, doesn't it? Both sides accuse the other of protectionism while engaging in actions that look pretty protectionist themselves. China criticizes U.S. tariffs but has forced tech transfer issues. The U.S. demands China follow WTO rules but seems to bypass them with tariffs. It definitely weakens the whole system.
Thinking longer term then, what about this risk of isolation for China that our article discussed? How could that actually happen?
Well, a long tariff war is one driver, but it's also about perceptions of China's broader tactics. Those mafia boss comparisons we mentioned relate to economic coercion.
And we gave examples in the article.
We did. The Belt and Road debt trap concerns, say in Sri Lanka or Pakistan. The trade actions against Australia, those tariffs on wine and barley after the COVID origin inquiry call, and the weaponizing of rare earth exports more recently.
How are other countries reacting to all this?
Our piece suggested a move towards caution and diversification. The EU, Japan looking to de-risk, reduce reliance on Chinese supply chains, Southeast Asian nations trying to balance relationships, and the U.S. and allies pushing things like the Chip Alliance to limit China's tech access.
But, as we also noted, complete isolation seems unlikely.
Probably unrealistic, yes. China's economy is just too big, too integrated. Countries like Russia, many in Africa, Central Asia, are still very reliant on Chinese investment. And China is building regional ties through things like RCEP.
So maybe not isolation, but fragmentation. A less unified global economy.
That seems more plausible. Regional blocs, more barriers, maybe growing diplomatic alienation for China, even if economic ties aren't totally severed.
What about the tariffs themselves? Are they actually working from the U.S. perspective? Our article questioned their effectiveness.
That's the big question. The U.S. goal is leverage forcing change on market access or subsidies. Our article mentioned the iPhone assembly line shutdowns in China as potential evidence of pressure and encouraging supply chain shifts.
That's the downsides.
Huge uncertainty. Tariffs might create some leverage, maybe, but they cost U.S. consumers and businesses. China's retaliation, like on rare earths, hurts too. And with the WTO dispute system weakened, it's hard to enforce any deal anyway.
Okay, let's pull back to the big picture, the fractured trade order. Our article's conclusion felt quite somber.
It did, because China maintains it has met its obligations, mostly, and sees U.S. actions as suppression. And China's own tech progress, especially in AI and chips, definitely fuels U.S. anxiety.
So these mutual accusations, the tariffs, the sense of broken promises, it really does feel like a crisis for global trade rules.
Exactly. The ongoing tariffs, alongside those unfulfilled WTO commitments, just cast a long shadow. It makes the future of global cooperation look very uncertain.
So wrapping this up, what does all this mean for you, our listener? As we laid out in our hkcitizen.net article, this deep dive shows global commerce is in a really tricky, evolving state. The rules we thought were agreed upon are being challenged.
Yeah, and that has real potential consequences for supply chains, for innovation, for international relations generally. Our article depicted a strained system where the two biggest players are, frankly, accused of undermining it.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? Has the optimism from 2001 when China joined the WTO just faded away, replaced by competition and protectionism?
It's a valid question.
And it leaves a big thought for you to consider. If the rules of trade are this contested, what role can organizations like the WTO realistically play going forward? And how will all these tensions ultimately reshape the global economy that connects us all?
Definitely a lot to keep watching. This is a complex story, and as we found writing our piece, it's still unfolding. We hope this dive helped unpack some of it.